So why don't we get started today with the Community and Cultural Development Committee. We have Councilmember Luna and Councilwoman Duff on the line. We have a couple agenda items to discuss. First agenda item is funding recommendations for CDBG, ESG, Home, and Human Services. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
All right. Let me just. Presentations 2A, here presentations to discuss the 2021 and prior years available funding for community development block grants. So I think we have a presentation from our housing director.
Good morning. Chair Heredia, council members Luna and Duff. Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today the funding recommendations on behalf of staff for fiscal year 2021 for CDBG, Home, Emergency Solutions Grant, and Human Services funding. As part of the preparation process for the city's annual action plan, which will serve as the city's application for funding, staff is requesting that the committee review, discuss, and approve the proposed funding recommendations for City Council consideration and approval. So I will be giving a brief overview of the funding process, the anticipated funding sources and available funds, and the staff's recommendations for each funding source. Just to provide a brief background, the City of Mesa has participated in the federal CDBG program for 43 years, the Home program for 27 years, and the ESG program for 31 years, and has received over $100 million in funding. And this funding serves critical needs to low and moderate income persons in our community. These federal programs fund a variety of activities, which could include capital improvements, housing programs, public services, and homeless services. The city does use an application process to solicit proposals annually from nonprofit agencies and from city departments for the use of all of the federal and local allocations. So I'd like to go through each funding source, which will identify the anticipated funding that we have, as well as a brief overview of the applications that we received, and then I will go specifically through each agency and funding source that we recommend for funding. So for our Community Development Block Grant Fund, we are actually anticipating an increase in allocation this year of 9%. So our anticipated allocation being $4,066,246,000, and we'll have reprogrammed funds in the amount of $1.9 million. That brings our CDBG total to a little over $6 million. For CDBG, we received a total of 20 applications. For our Home Investment Partnership Program, we anticipate receiving $1.4 million with reprogrammed funds of $239,000. For the Home program, we received 5 applications. For our Emergency Solutions Grant, our allocation is $327,701. We do not have any reprogrammed funds, so that is the total we have available. For ESG, we received 4 applications. For our Human Services programs, we anticipate an allocation of $570,000, and of course this is the funding source that we received the most applications, and we received 39 applications for Human Services, for a total of 68 applications for all funding sources included. So I'd like to take you through the individual funding sources and the recommendations that we can review together. And if you have any questions, please let me know as we go through. So the first funding allocations would be for 2021 CDBG funding for public services. And with public services, there is a maximum cap of 15% of funding of our current allocation. So that is $627,464. We received 9 applications in the public services funding, and we recommend funding for 6 agencies for a total of $627,464. So if you'd like to ask any questions on the specific agencies, I won't necessarily go through each individual one unless you have questions. And then we can move on to the next slide, which would include the CDBG public facility improvements.
Any questions? Keep going.
Okay, thank you. So our next kind of pot of money for CDBG is our non-public services, which includes any type of projects such as housing activities, public facility improvements, and other public improvements. In this funding category, we received 11 applications and recommend funding for 7 projects. You will see here in this funding source, we have a total of $4,568,000 available because we did have some reprogrammed funds in this category for activities that didn't move forward. The recommended funding for these projects is $3,871,000. There is a large priority this year to fund homeless services and homeless type activities, especially housing, as well as any other critical needs for those most vulnerable populations. Any questions on the CDBG housing and public facilities?
Yeah, I think Councilman Luna, right?
Thank you, Michelle, for that presentation. Now, when I look at City of Mesa Homeless Service Project for $1,500,000, can you give me some specifics in terms of what we're going to be looking at? Just a little bit more detail and explanation of what that's going to be like.
Yes, Chair Heredia, Council Members Luna and Duff. I can give you a preliminary idea of what we're looking at, as we don't have all the details for this specific project. But as we're all aware, in our community here in Mesa, we have a large population of homeless individuals, and it's an increasing issue every day, and a lack of the number of services and beds available. So at the direction of the city manager's office and working with Natalie Lewis, we are working on a homeless initiative, kind of a strategic plan, and hope to use some of these dollars either specifically in the city or as a regional approach to address the growing needs of the homeless population.
Michelle, are we looking at possibly hiring more navigators, or are we looking to try to support some of our agencies that are providing homeless shelters currently? So those are kind of questions I have relative to that.
Yes, Chair Heredia, Council Members Luna and Duff. We are, as I mentioned, our priority this year is funding those agencies with homeless services. And so I'm bringing us back to the slide for the CDBG public services, as the majority of the agencies here are funded for homeless services. For example, Community Bridges, their homeless navigation services. They're actually adding 2 additional navigators to this program. And then Mark Community Resources, they also are a navigation program and a homeless day center, which includes the navigation for community court. And as we look through with a new leaf, we have supportive services for their shelters, for East Valley Men's Center, and also Community Bridges for their community outreach and crisis stabilization. So that would be any kind of like substance abuse, any type of crisis, and that usually fits the population of those homeless individuals. Did I answer?
Michelle, I also had a question on Love Your Neighbor. Tell me specifically how that addresses our issue related to homelessness.
Okay, so with the Love Your Neighbor program, and I may ask Ray to come up and talk a little bit about this. My understanding of this program is it's more of a concentrated rehabilitation. So it's a revitalization of an identified area within the city that really could help homeowners revitalization with not only their house, but it helps with kind of the community neighborhood. So in terms of homelessness, it doesn't necessarily address the homeless individuals. However, we find that providing rehabilitation to low-income individuals helps them stay in their homes. And so they have a habitable, affordable unit that they continue to reside in. And Ray, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. Does that answer your question, Councilman?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. Any other questions I can answer?
Councilwoman Duff, you have a question?
Yes, going back to the city's allocation of $1.5 million for facilities. I'm sorry, I think I blanked out for a minute there. But what is our timeline in being able to identify a project on that? And if we don't get it, we don't use it this year, does it roll over?
Council members, this is Natalie Lewis. I'll go ahead and jump in on this because I've been working on it for the last couple of days. There's a couple things going on as it relates to this particular pot of funds and opportunities that we would have. Before we entered into this emergency and crisis situation, we were talking with some of our nonprofit partners about how we could add on and create additional capacity at existing facilities, or looking at new areas where we could add capacity for emergency housing. Our goal as a city is to basically have a continuum of housing, so that when we come to and find homeless individuals, we get them into emergency housing immediately. They're able to progress into something that helps them into a stabilization type of a process with more wraparound services, and then eventually into permanent supportive housing, so that they're as sustainable as possible. So we're still looking at that as a community, because that's our goal, and we're having that conversation regionally as well, because Mesa can't do this all on our own. So a lot of those conversations are still going, though they have been slowed down just in the last week because of our emergency. And so another opportunity for use of these dollars, which would probably happen more quickly than the former, what I was just talking about, is a regional response to needing some immediate health-related housing and shelter for our homeless community. We're going to have some additional conversations, and I think that it's pretty safe to say that we're going to be asked as a city, as will others, to participate financially, and this pot of dollars might be part of that. But what's being talked about regionally are looking at hotels and motels and leasing those temporarily, so that we can quarantine homeless populations who are at risk or who have been exposed and showing symptoms and not showing symptoms, but helping to alleviate overcrowding at our hospitals. We're looking at all of the shelters that we have in the entire region and assessing capacity at this very moment, and if there's any creative uses to add capacity. And they're looking at a 24/7 nursing line, so that anyone who is coming across our homeless, and if they have medical questions, they can get answers right away. So these are some of the regional discussions that are underway today, and that Mesa, if the council chooses, may end up participating in and using a portion or all of this $1.5 million.
Okay, thank you.
Question, Councilmember Luna.
Thank you, Natalie. So are we looking at maybe shifting some of these CDBG dollars to work towards dealing with the COVID crisis? And then we just heard recently that the Senate just approved a $1 trillion package. Are we going to look at trying to get some of that money via CDBG to work with our COVID crisis that we're currently experiencing?
Yes, Councilmember Heredia and Councilmember Luna. That's precisely what we're looking at. We're looking at any and all opportunities right now from federal funding and resources, and we're just doing that at a regional level so that we are all staying apprised and that the response that we have to this crisis is unified and consistent. So we're trying to do that as much as possible. So if the council chooses, and if the committee today chooses to say, we would like to appropriate a portion of these dollars for that regional effort, that is your prerogative.
I would support that. I think it's essential right now that we allocate some of that funding to deal with our COVID crisis in whatever capacity that we can. And, you know, we have a number of homeless people that live in our community, and I'm concerned about where are they going to go? And we have to figure out how we can place them in a safe area and safely quarantine them.
Just going off that, thank you, Natalie. As far as timeline is concerned, I know this is an evolving process, you know, each day as we're seeing more, you know, especially on the COVID side, as far as the numbers only rising. So is there both on that end, but also the continuing talks that we're having on the overall homelessness issue and what that service project that we have potentially allocated 1.5 million in the budget. What's kind of the timeline on those aspects that you're kind of estimating?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Heredia. The timeline for the emergency response and the COVID response is going to be in the closer near future. So I would say within the next few weeks, we're going to have a lot more direction and clarification on a regional level as to what we're going to be participating in. As it relates to using other funds for expanding existing facilities, what I'll probably be doing, and again, this does evolve every single day and it changes every single day, but I'll be looking for ways to have the monies that the City of Mesa uses regionally to also help us in our longer term efforts of expanding shelter here regionally. So we're going to look at all of those things. I can't give you an absolute timeline for that. But what I can do is keep you apprised as key decisions are being made.
Okay. Yeah, I think just my general concern on because these CDBG dollars do have to be somewhat shovel ready before the fiscal year. Am I correct? If not, we have to look at transitioning these funding to other projects, right? So just worrying that, you know, that 1.5 million, I'm sure, you know, we're able to use it once we do have a project, but if that project will be ready by when we have to kind of show to the feds what we have. And so that's my only concern on this. I agree with the kind of concept of, you know, looking at how we allocate these dollars to the issue around homelessness. But that's my, just looking in that timeline wise, it's going to be important moving forward.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Heredia, and I really appreciate you being sensitive to that issue. We are as well. For the longer term projects, we were looking at using the dollars more for rehab, which would allow us to immediately invest. And HUD has given some guidelines about how the funds can be used for COVID-19. And there are several things that we can do that are in the rehabilitation and improvements of facilities and purchasing different supplies and things that are needed that we might be able to use our funds for so that they're more immediately dispersed in a timely way.
Yeah, and just to add another point is, I don't know if the process would go back to us here at the CCD committee or straight to council, but just whatever the process is, I'm sure, you know, working coordination, what both our short-term and long-term plans whatever the response to the COVID-19 plans are around homelessness, that they, they kind of work in conjunction, I would say. It's going to be important as we move forward on this issue, I believe. Any other questions on this? Are we okay to move forward with the other parts of the presentation? Perfect. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Councilman Heredia. Okay, we'll move on to the Home Investment Partnership Program. This year we received, hold on just a moment, I'm sorry. This year we received a total of 5 applications, and we're recommending funding for 4. Home allocations this year, we had a request for $1,464,000, and we are recommending funding for $914,000, which would fund 4 specific projects. These projects all fit the priority of addressing homelessness, except for, of course, down payment assistance. But as you look through the projects here, we have tenant-based rental assistance programs. Each one of them are a little bit different. The first City of Mesa tenant-based rental program would be for deposits. So individuals who are either on the list for the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program or the general public that fit that low-income criteria could receive assistance with their deposits. And then the second tenant-based rental assistance for $300,000 would be actual rental assistance. So we can do that for a maximum of 2 years. So it's more of a stabilized, longer-term supportive housing. The Community Bridges tenant-based rental program is very similar to what the city would be administrating, except that addresses the critical needs for those homeless individuals when the navigators are out in the community. Any questions on the home?
Yeah, Councilmember Luna.
Hey, Michelle, what's a typical down payment assistance that we offer our community members? Is that a percentage based on what their mortgage is going to be? How is that? How do you figure that out?
Thank you, Councilman. I'm new to the program with that. Ray has mentioned to me that it is a $30,000 down payment assistance. We also will work with other nonprofit agencies in the community for housing counseling, because housing counseling is a requirement in order to get down payment assistance. And there are other sources available, such as the IDA funds and WISH funds. So it could come over $30,000, and it just depends on the dollar amount of the house that they're looking at and how we can make that subsidy work, because they do have to meet that low income criteria. Does that answer your question, Councilman?
Yes. So are we looking at a home that's $150,000, $200,000, or less than that?
HUD publishes a maximum amount, which is our limit every year. Right now, it's currently at $220,000. So you would have to purchase something that would be 95% of that maximum amount. And so then the subsidy and subsidy layering would be dependent upon how we can make that particular property work for that individual with their income.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're very welcome.
Hey, Michelle, real quick, Councilwoman Duff.
I also have a question on the down payment assistance, and which I agree with, because I think that one of the biggest things we can do is help people get into homes to guard against these rental increases, which have been off the charts and create a lot of havoc in people being able to stay in places as that escalates. But, and that's a way to guard against it, by having a steady payment that you're making instead of having increases. So what are Now, if a person resells that home, or what's the payback or the recapture or requirements in order to, that we have that investment with them and the responsibilities of that?
Is this on? Yeah. Councilmember Duff, the way that our program works is we do a recapture provision. So any kind of assistance that we provide them, it is recaptured if they sell the home before the period of affordability ends. So a typical example is right now we give up to $30,000 in down payment assistance. The period of affordability during that time frame is 10 years. That is forgiven over that 10 years. A portion is forgiven, so it's prorated over those 10 years. If they were to sell their home at year 5, essentially they would have to pay back $15,000, which is basically half of that money.
Thank you.
And then a question on the tenant-based rental program, Michelle. Is that administered through Mesa Can or through the city?
Councilman Heredia, so the first two, the City of Mesa tenant-based rental assistant programs, those would both be administered by the City of Mesa. So the first one is administered out of our housing office for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but again, that's open to other individuals as well. And then the $300,000 was allocated this year to try to assist in funding additional services for the homeless. So that would be kind of a new program that we would be administering, and this would be part of that strategic homeless initiative.
Any other questions? Don't see it. All right, let's continue.
Thank you. Okay, so for emergency shelter, emergency services, we had a total of 4 applications, and we're recommending funding for 3 applications. We do have a 60% maximum cap on funds for shelter operations. And what we have allocated here is out of the $303,000, we are less than the 60%. So the only activity here that is not operations would be the Save the Family and the Southwest Lutheran Social Services. That is more of rapid rehousing. It's a collaboration between the faith-based agency and Save the Family, and that's more for emergency housing, kind of that dusk to dawn bed nights. So total recommendation of funding is the $303,123. Any questions on that?
On this? No? Keep on going.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so human services funding. Oh, excuse me. This is quite a larger Excel spreadsheet here for me to look at. So for human services, this pot of funding, we obviously get the most number of applications in, and these funds are used to promote self-sufficiency and provide services to those that are most vulnerable in our community, such as meals and homeless bed nights, and to also encourage partnerships between our private sector, government, and community providers. Again, priority on homeless services and those critical services to the most vulnerable individuals. We received 39 applications and recommend funding for 12 programs and services. So because this is kind of a lengthy list, we can go through them individually, or if you have questions specifically on here, on this screen, you'll see that we are recommending funding for Mesa Can, which is the program similar to our tenant-based rental assistance, where they have home dollars, or, I'm sorry, not home dollars, but it mimics a home tenant-based rental assistance program where they would be able to give emergency type deposits and money towards utility bills if somebody thinks that they're not gonna be able to pay their utility bill for a month or two, and also for emergency rent if somebody loses their job and they're in a dire situation. That's more emergency type funding. Paz de Cristo is for homeless services, basic services, meals, wraparound services. Teen Lifeline is for crisis services, for suicide prevention, which is a very critical service in the community. Any questions on these agencies?
What does Autumn House do?
Autumn House is a domestic violence shelter.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And that's operated by New Leaf, right?
Correct.
Any other questions? I know this part is the most difficult as we got so many applications for this type of funding, and it's every year that we have to try to fit with the priorities that we have as a city, looking at, you know, especially homelessness that has been a priority for several years now, but particularly this year, even more. So any other questions that folks have on the funding and allocation for the human services funding? I know on the presentation, there's a document with all the applicants and who were awarded. So not sure if you all were able to review that.
Councilmember Heredia, this is the second page to the funding recommendations for human services. And again, if you have any specific questions on these agencies, we are also recommending funding for food type services. So the last one, Arizona Brain Food, those are weekend food bags, nutritional items for those kiddos that may not be getting adequate meals over the weekend. Meals on Wheels program, obviously very critical for serving those elderly disabled folks that are homebound. And United Food Bank for emergency and supplemental food assistance programs. Any
Yeah, we
specific?
got a question, Councilmember Luna.
So Michelle, given the COVID crisis, I know there is going to be a need for more allocation of food, especially when we look at the closure of schools through the Arizona Brain Food, Astor with the Meals on Wheels. Is there another? Are they going to run out of money to continue to provide these essential services to our community, given the situation that we find ourselves in?
Councilmember, it's possible that there could be shortage of funding. You know, all the agencies, I'm sure it changes day by day on, you know, what the needs are and what the resources are. You know, if it was the desire of the committee and council to reallocate funds, you know, for some of those more critical services in light of the COVID, we could do that. Just going back over to what Natalie was mentioning about the Cdbg program, we can utilize some of those dollars for specific crisis needs related to COVID-19. There hasn't been a lot of direction that has been provided, but as of March 13th, they did indicate that you could coordinate with local health authorities and take on additional activities to address the pandemic. Eligible activities could be both public services, which would be kind of the Meals on Wheels and some of those critical daily services, or it could be facility type projects, as Natalie was discussing, such as constructing a testing facility or rehabbing an existing facility to put individuals who are recovering from the COVID virus. But if we do utilize any of the Cdbg funding for public service activities, say to provide more meal service or testing kits or anything related to that for the COVID, we would have that limit of 15% still, of that 15% cap.
So Natalie, since I can see you, the federal dollars that hopefully will come as a result of the COVID crisis, will we be able to go ahead and support these agencies that are providing food to our most vulnerable population here in the city of Mesa? And I know it's hard to tell when we're going to get the funds, but we may need to access them quickly to make sure that we are able to feed our most vulnerable populations during this time of crisis.
Yes, Councilmember Reddy and Councilmember Luna. The good news is we had a conference call with dozens of our food providers and partners in Mesa just earlier this week, and they have told us that at this point they're good. They've got what they need. Some of them are having to change the way they provide food. So instead of hot meals, for example, they're doing grab and go types of meals. And so they need a little bit more help in food preparation and volunteers. And so we're working with them on that. But as it relates to food supplies, they're in good shape for the moment. But yes, as we move forward in this process, and if there are additional needs there, we would definitely be looking at this federal funding and this pot for making sure that we're helping to provide some of those basic services.
Yeah, I would just add maybe Natalie, and I'm sure you're all looking at this. I know, both the feds and the state, talking about some of this response money and how cities can tap into those. I'm not sure if there's either ongoing analysis through our legislative folks being done on how we can tap into those monies so that we can create some coordination with what we're funding here and how we can expand some of the more immediate items, but also kind of seeing how we leverage these activities moving forward for our residents, especially around homelessness, so that we can be strategic and effective in our outreach as we use taxpayer funding to do this work. Okay. Any other questions, Councilwoman Duff?
On the subject of the COVID-19 and what we're doing to contribute to those nonprofits that are providing food and such, is that, yes, there are some immediate needs, but we also, and I know there's federal funding, but I think we also need to look at this as something more long-term than the immediate. I think there's going to be repercussions from this probably for about a year until a vaccination is created. Even though we might be on the downslope of our hump, it'll be present in our society, and we'll be having to manage it throughout for a longer term and then the immediate. And so that we think about, do we need to give additional support, or how does that additional support come to those who are providing those services to those in need?
For sure. And I would add also the economic factors that if a prolonged, economic impact happens, how that looks out around housing, for folks that are bordering kind of from homelessness or, being affected by losing work and those kinds of things, so that we can kind of manage our approaches as well on what would be the most effective strategies out there. So, going along with food, but also housing and other portions of what, this issue could impact our residents.
Councilmember Heredia and Councilwoman Duff, two things just to keep in mind as well as we move forward in a longer term strategy. We are working on a regional homeless strategic plan, and so this entire emergency will now be a part of that as it relates to what's the impact has been long term and how we're going to respond to that. We're also working on the housing master plan, and so that's another tool that you all will be coming directly to you for consideration, and that this conversation can be woven within.
Councilwoman Duff?
Yes. One thing that we aren't funding this year or have any money set aside for is the affordable housing. Now, I understand our priority of the homelessness, and I'm not debating that, but at some point, we need to give some attention and planning. I know we're having the housing plan, but on affordable housing, there's some federal action as far as increasing the number of vouchers, which doesn't really help if we don't have properties that will accept them. And I know that's a separate issue from affordable housing. But we do need to look at affordable housing because we don't have the properties that will accept vouchers. And I know this is a regional concern, and it is part of the homelessness picture of having those places where people can afford to live and stay there. And especially around the COVID-19, whatever we can do on eviction assistance. There's a federal bill before all the COVID-19, maybe that can be expanded, but I think we could dramatically increase our homelessness with the current rate of evictions in this current market, let alone the crisis that we're facing now. So the whole housing thing is something I'm concerned about, which is related to our homelessness efforts.
Yeah, thank you, Councilwoman Duff. I think that's something that we definitely need to dive even more on. Other strategies. Along with the homelessness efforts. How do we look at moving forward on the affordable housing piece in what works for our city moving forward? But I know that's another discussion with the housing master plan and other tools that we might have. Maybe Natalie convening something further on that end in the future would be worthwhile to look into the different strategies, especially as we're finalizing the master plan and a couple other plans updates that we're having for the city.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I'll coordinate that with you, Councilmember Heredia.
Perfect. Michelle, do you have anything else?
Councilmember Heredia, I wanted to just add that in terms of affordable housing, and if it, was the desire of the council at some point mid-year to talk about affordable housing or additional beds for homeless or whatever that need might be, we do have funding that is unallocated in our Cdbg non-public services and in our home dollars. And those are two pots of money that we could utilize to address housing. So it's good that we have that additional funding so that we have some flexibility kind of as things change here in the economy, and we might want to revisit that down the road here a little bit.
Michelle, do you know the totals, what we have available?
Yes, Councilmember Heredia. For our non-public services, which again is more of our housing, public facilities types projects, we have a total of $4,568,000 available, of which recommended funding for the agencies we've discussed today is $3,871,000, which leaves a remaining balance of $697,000. In addition to that, if we receive any program income during the fiscal year, and program income is generated by, say like a housing rehab project that we had funded and the folks decided to sell their home and they owe that portion back to us, that becomes program income to the city. We reprogram it into our larger pot of funds. So we do get additional funding throughout the year as well. And then for our home program, for home, we have a total of $1,599,000, of which $914,000 is recommended for award, which leaves a remaining balance of $685,000. So a little, if you combine the two, a little bit over 1.2 million.
Okay.
So if there are no further questions with regard to the recommended funding, I just wanted to quickly go over the next steps here in our timeline. So for March 26th, we will be presenting at the City Council study session these recommendations, or if you so choose to revisit those before we finish this meeting. And then on March 30th, we will have a 30-day public comment period that will commence. That's required as part of our application for funding. At this point, we are going to be hosting 1 to 2 public hearings, but in light of the COVID virus, we are trying to find alternate ways of doing that so that we're not, jeopardizing individuals in a public setting. So there'll be more information to come on those specific details. And then May 4th, we'll be going to City Council to get the final approval of funding for all the agencies, all of the funding sources, and as well as our 5-year consolidated plan, which is due for this year, which will set forth all of our priorities over the next 5 years to be funded with. So if there aren't any other questions, that concludes my presentation.
So real quick, have all the nonprofits been sent a message on the funding allocations?
So Councilmember Heredia, yes, all of the agencies were sent out a message through our application system. It's an electronic system, informing them that they could come to the council meeting today or watch it electronically. They could submit comment, and they did have links to all the information, all the spreadsheets, and all the documents that were presented to you as well.
Any other questions? Nope. Perfect. And I don't know, Ms. Mickelson, do we have any comments?
I don't believe we have any on this item. Mike Hughes is in the audience, I believe, for the next agenda item, but I've received no request for this item.
Perfect. Well, moving on to next presentation to be.
Chairperson Heredia, this particular item requires presentation, discuss, and provide some funding recommendations. So are there recommendations of the committee that you'd like to give?
Councilwoman Duff or Luna?
I move that we approve staff recommendations for approval.
And I'll second that.
And committee members, we don't require a particular vote on this one. There's not a motion on the table, so it would just be general recommendations from the committee.
Sounds good. I think we should move forward from my end.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can move forward with these recommendations set up by staff. With I think the ongoing coordination of what we've been talking about with what we're having as far as the crisis that we have going on, and how this kind of intersects with the funding that we're providing the agencies and the different programs, right? So, all right.
Thank you very much.
Is that enough as far as a recommendation?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, now moving on to item 2B here, presentation, discussion, and provide recommendation on the transfer of 2 city-owned properties to a new leaf. Is that Michelle again?
Yes, Councilman Heredia is, and just give me a moment here to switch the screen over. And grab my notes here. Okay, thank you very much. So we are going to be discussing and seeking guidance from the committee and recommendations for possible transfer of 2 city-owned properties that would be brought to City Council for further discussion. We did come to study session on January 23rd, and the City Council requested further discussion and analysis on 2 of 3 properties that we proposed to transfer over to a new leaf. Those 2 properties are the main property and university property. We do not include the address there for confidentiality, but those are 2 properties that we'll be discussing. So the additional information that was requested of council was to identify what the current market value of each of those properties are in 2020, to look and evaluate if there's any city-owned property that we could possibly use as an exchange, that we could relocate a new leaf to and possibly sell one or both of the other properties, and then any other funding considerations or costs that we would need to look at, which would also include any available federal funding. And the third property that actually we presented to the council on the 23rd was approved on the council meeting at the 27th for the Hobson property transfer. So we'll talk quickly about the main property. This property was appraised in 2017 at $166,000. Based on current area comps, in working very closely with our real estate department, looking at value of similar property, that range right now is anywhere from $300,000 to $325,000, which could be an approximate increase in value of $134,000 to $159,000. And again, this was not an actual appraisal of the property, it was just based on current area comps. For the university property, the September 2017 appraisal was $350,000. And again, looking at current area comps, we have a range for similar properties from $500,000 to $560,000, which would be an approximately increase of $150,000 to $210,000. So with this information, staff researched and made some determinations. We worked closely with the city's real estate division to look at other properties that could be available and also to get the comps on those 2 properties for similar type land and properties. We did identify that there are currently no city-owned properties that are vacant and available, which would be able to be used by a new leaf. We do have some additional properties that had been purchased with federal dollars. However, the federal regulations do not allow transitional housing as a use for that funding. A new leaf could submit funding through our next proposal process for fiscal year 21-22 for the purposes of locating, acquiring, and rehabilitation of a new alternate location. And then the city has a couple options, which I'll go through on the next slide, if that were the case and they did want to relocate. So some options for consideration would be to sell, transfer, or continue to lease one or both of the properties. And I'll go over those options. So option number 1 would be to sell the main property and the university property. Of course, it could be either or both. Sell at the current fair market value. This could trigger displacement and relocation. So if there's folks that are in the transitional shelter at this time, we could have to relocate them, pay temporary relocation or permanent displacement relocation, which could be potential costs to the city and or a new leaf. If we did sell the property, because it is a change of use that would not be eligible under Cdbg anymore, we would return those funds to our Cdbg line of credit, and then we would reprogram those, which could be used if New Leaf wanted to come back for funding, to submit a proposal and possibly use some of those funds for purchase, acquisition, and rehab of another facility. Second option for consideration would be to transfer one or both, the main property, the university property, over to a New Leaf. We could transfer both properties over. We could consider a longer continued use period. So at the last council study session, we discussed that the minimum requirement, if we're going to transfer the property, is a continued use of 10 years, and that was per the requirements of HUD. So we could in transferring these properties, ask for a longer period of time. The city could continue to own the properties through the continued use period, and New Leaf would continue to maintain the properties as they have for several years, 20 to 30 years on each of the properties. And then a New Leaf would continue to comply with the CDBG continued use regulations.
Committee members, if I could add some clarification on that. So if the city chose to transfer the properties to New Leaf, the city would not continue to own the properties through the continued use period, but they would be required to meet those requirements. We could have things such as a right of reverter or other options in the documents that if a New Leaf didn't operate the properties the way they were required to under the uses, then we could take that back or add some sort of restrictive covenants to the use of the properties. But just to clarify, on a transfer, the city would not continue to own the properties. The only option of the three where the city would continue to own the properties is on the lease option.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, there just maybe question from there. Would they be eligible then to sell if they do get the buildings?
Chairperson Heredia and committee members, it depends on how we would word some of the restrictions on the property. We could potentially do that. I'd have to go back and do a little bit of research related to real estate on that. But at a minimum, we could put some restrictions on the property where they're required to use it, and we have to approve any sale of the property.
And if I could just add, Councilmember Heredia, with the CDBG regulations and requirements, they would have to maintain the property for that same use or a similar use that would meet the national objectives for CDBG, and that would have to be brought to the city and go through a public process if they wanted to change what that use is. But if over that, say, 10-year period, they were going to sell it or convert it to a different use that doesn't meet CDBG requirements, then that would trigger back some type of payment to the CDBG program.
So the timeline is 10 years, you're saying, in that, would it come back to the council or to the city for us to do some action on that if they are, interested in selling?
Councilman Heredia, if they chose to sell after the 10 years, they're free and clear after the 10 years of any restrictions on the property. So during the 10 years, they would have to come back to the city because we would have some type of restriction, some kind of covenant or declarative land use on the property.
Okay, that was my question. Yep.
Thank you.
From now to 10 years, right? So, anything else, Michelle?
Chairperson Heredia, if I might add to that. So one of the options that we would have is to require that they either have to come back to the council for to approve a sale, or that can be something that can be authorized through the city manager's office as well. So there are options the city has in terms of approval for them being able to move forward with the sale of that property.
Okay, so I'll go on to option consideration number 3. Is continue leasing the main property and university property to New Leaf. So they would continue to lease those properties with their continued use. We would own those properties. New Leaf would continue to maintain the properties and continue to comply with CDBG regulations. So this option here is basically what New Leaf is doing currently and has been for several years on these 2 properties. Are there any questions I can answer on the specific options or any other questions that might be of consideration through our real estate department?
Yes, I think we have Councilmember Luna a question and then Councilwoman Duff. I know Mr. Hughes is also in the audience, so maybe we want to bring him in, but let's start with Councilmember Luna.
Thank you, Chair Heredia. Actually, I wanted to bring Mike in to give us an idea of what kind of programming is currently available on those properties, and if the sale or the transfer if we decide not to allow the transfer, how would it impact their ability to offer programs through a new lease? So would that be appropriate to have them come up now?
Yes, Councilman Luna, we do have Mike here at the table, and I will turn it over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, committee members. First of all, I would like to say that the city has done this many times in the past. So we have been a partner with these CDBG properties with Mesa Can, with the East Valley Men's Center, with La Mesita. So this is nothing, in a sense, new that the city has done for us. Secondly, we have been in these properties for a very, very long time. Third, you need to know, not only from myself, but from the board, they have no interest in selling these properties. It just gives us a stronger sense of site control so that when we need improvements, we are able to go to the bank and prove or show that we have ownership so we can make the improvements. That was incredibly necessary, and the city was very helpful when you did that for us at the East Valley Men's Center and also at La Mesita, which we were able to transform. Currently, we would really like to be able to expand the university property and put our DV program, DV Stop. That is a safe temporary overflow program, which is currently on another location at University Drive near Horn. This would give us the opportunity to expand that, and that program is basically a assistance program for when all the shelters are full throughout the valley. We actually can house them at our DV Stop site, and then as soon as a bed opens up, we then transfer them to a shelter. The university property would be ideal for that. The Mesa Drive property is currently housing women that have transitioned out of Autumn House and yet do not have a place to go. And so they are there, and we house them, and it's kind of like a transitional use. But I know that there's been many questions in regards to this, but please know that A New Leaf is very committed to the city. We are very committed to what you have done in supporting us, and there would be no drive for us to sell these properties. This just puts us in a stronger position to run the programs of which the city historically has always supported. And so we would appreciate the transfer because we think it's the best need for A New Leaf, and we also think it would help the clients long-term for us. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Hey, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Mike, I have a question. You just said that if we transfer the properties, then the agency would then be responsible for any upkeep or any remodeling or fixing up the properties to make sure that they're up to code as far as providing the services you need for your clients. Is that correct?
Well, let me clarify that. The ability for us to, we are responsible for the upkeep and the improvements anyway. So we've been doing that for a number of years. What it gives us the opportunity to do is when we do these upkeep and these projects, sometimes the lending institutions are very hesitant to not want to lend the money because we do not have the ownership. With us having the ownership, we are able to do that. A case in point is, of course, La Mesita. So that would be the main difference of support that we would benefit from.
Yes, because I remember being on the board of New Leaf, and then when I removed myself and was part of the Community Cultural Development Committee, one of the issues that came about was we were sinking money into the old La Mesita facility, And we just were constantly sinking money into it. And then the agency decided to go ahead and proceed with a new development that's located on Main Street. So historically, you've done a great job. You've done a great job in terms of using the properties appropriately. And so, so I'm going to support the transfer of the properties to a new leaf because you have a record. You've been in the city of Mesa for many, many years now. 40 years now, Mike? Is that right?
Almost.
40 plus years?
We're coming up on 50 years.
50 years, and you've continued to be a good partner with the city of Mesa. So my recommendation is go ahead and transfer the properties. But that's just me only, so you've got to hear from my other colleagues. Thank you, Mike.
Councilwoman Duff, you have some comments, questions?
Well, I too appreciate all the work that New Leaf does. It does make a difference in our community. And the reason the transfer was deferred in making this decision again is these particular properties being in opportune areas. For instance, the university property is the entrance off of University to our historic district. And it does have some struggles along that street, is trying to turn around. Over the years, the property in this historic district has doubled and tripled, but there's still some struggles. So it's not about not supporting New Leaf as it is it the highest and best use at this location? And are there other ways to support New Leaf, but not necessarily given these addresses? And that has been my struggle. Especially in the central and downtown area, the face of many of our arterial streets are nonprofits. And we have, been under this, as we saw in our presentation at council, under our central business district, trying to turn around these areas and allowing them to be prosperous and more economically viable. Now, I appreciate the support services, but I just don't know if it needs to be on a major arterial into an entrance, and the other one is on the face of the arterial, which will also be across from our site 17. So that has been my struggle. Now, the university property currently is used as an IT location. I questioned whether that can be relocated. I understand you want to turn it into a DV property. And then on the main property, how many
the Mesa Drive
women
property.
does that, excuse me?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say, Council Member, that is the Mesa Drive property.
Right, yeah. It was identified in the presentation as main property, but anyway, how many women does that house?
We currently have between 4 and 6 women that are there, because it's basically a 4-bedroom house.
Okay. So my questions were on this. I mean, would it even be possible to use some of the city dollars, the Cdbg funding that we have set aside for the city, and what we haven't quite identified how we're going to use those dollars in this year to buy new properties for a new leaf so they could transition into those. And with the current real estate market, which I assume will stay strong despite the circumstances because of the shortage of housing, especially in this area, it would be a quick sale and be able to return those dollars back in to the use for the Cdbg, definitely by the beginning of the 21 year. That is, one of my thoughts that I have. I just am concerned the number of nonprofit properties we have all over the arterials, and that our commitment to keep those on the major arterials over long term. And so I think need to take it property by property and decide as they become available, or, you know, can we support New Leaf by having it, more tucked into the neighborhoods instead of a major arterial that has economic value?
Councilmember
those-
Duff? Oh, I'm
Those are my
sorry.
concerns.
Is it okay if I respond?
Yes, go ahead. Sure.
Councilmember Duff, I certainly hear you, but I really do think it's worth noting that one of the reasons why it has been successful on these major arterial roadways is the transportation opportunity, because many of these people do not have automobiles. So that is actually a support to them. The other thing I would like to add, you can go up and down University Drive, and as you know, we have a lot of properties. And I would just like to candidly say that our properties are probably kept up better than any of the other properties that are along these major arterial transportation ways. And we have always been commented on, we do a better job than anybody in terms of making the appearance and the presentation look good for not only a New Leaf, but for the city, because we've always appreciated these opportunities. And we probably have 8 or 9 properties on University, and to all of them look better than most of the properties along these major streets.
Absolutely, they do. And I appreciate the quality of the properties that you have, along University and other areas, and that you do a great job in the upkeep. But what I am concerned about is not the presentation of the properties, they're great, but about the economic use, especially as we're a city who needs to attract residences, employment, and sales tax dollars to the central area. Now, I understand transportation too, and I'm absolutely a proponent of putting services and housing close to transportation. But whether it's a block in or whatever, it is still in the transportation area. I'm not talking about moving it outside of the transportation area. I'm talking on a major location that has, economic value. It's going to be a business or retail or contributing to the welfare of the economics of our city. So that's my comment about that.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? I see, the opportunity, I understand Councilwoman Duff, as, comments around, as we changing the face of downtown and how we can really have even more prosperous look. With that said, I think, looking at the services that New Leaf provides and how the essential of maintaining some continuity with folks that have these services there with transportation and other wraparound services that we have around the area. That's a big concern for me, and how they can access those points of contact. And I don't know if there's other, within the options, particularly number 2, per what the, New Leaf is asking as far as a transfer, if there is a medium here, ensuring that, all the kind of standards or I know we're going through some of the design standards of buildings in our downtown and other parts of the city. If that is any potential moving forward, ensuring that we can add some, the look and feel that it maintains to what we are moving towards to, if any remodeling is happening. I don't know if that's something that we should be looking at. I asked, Councilwoman Duff, this is part of your district, and I'm not very familiar with these properties but I don't know if that is of a concern or an opportunity there that we can look into when we set up this either potential transfer or another option here. Councilman Luna?
So maybe this question is for Michelle. I know a New Leaf has put an enormous amount of money into maintaining these properties over their period. They're not going to be able to recover this money, right? They've programmed it, and they made sure the properties were sufficient, safe, and appropriate for the different programs they've had in place. And they've actually spent a lot of money to upkeep these properties. Will they be able to recover some of those dollars, or were these dollars specific, only CDBG dollars? Maybe Michelle can answer that, or maybe Natalie.
Councilmember Luna, yes, I'd be happy to answer that. So the purchase of the properties were with CDBG funds. After New Leaf has been leasing the property from us, from the city, they have in turn put in their own funds. No CDBG funds that I'm aware of additionally have been put in for the rehabilitation of the properties. So any ongoing maintenance, utility bills, all those kinds of things, those are all covered costs from a New Leaf, and they would not be reimbursed any of those costs through the sale. So as I mentioned previously, the sale would require those funds to go directly back to the CDBG line of credit, so there's no benefit to the city's general fund on that, and there wouldn't be any reimbursement over to the New Leaf as either. Any other questions on that? Did that answer that question?
So Councilmember Duff raised a question in terms of, are there other properties that are very similar to the existing properties that New Leaf could quickly move into to ensure that their programs continue as they are now?
Councilmember Luna, so as I mentioned previously, the city does not have any properties that we would be able to quickly transition a New Leaf to. We would have to possibly look at utilizing CDBG and or home dollars to find a location, acquire it, and rehabilitate it. Now, there are some limitations and restrictions when we're using the funds. So if we're going to purchase a property with home dollars, there is that maximum $220,000 that you can spend using home dollars. So that could be quite a challenge to try to find a property that would meet the needs of a 4 or 5 bedroom unit under that cost. And then we would be able to use CDBG funds to renovate the property, but also keeping in mind that there would be costs for relocating a New Leaf because they do have occupants that are currently there, so it would be temporary relocation, which would be additional costs to the city that can be paid with CDBG, but it is additional dollars to consider. If a New Leaf needed to do this quickly, we could do a special funding process mid-year. We would most likely trigger what's called a substantial amendment with our funds if it's over 20% of our allocation. So we would have to submit that to HUD and get approval to use those funds for those purposes. Or a New Leaf could wait till the next funding process, which is the 21-22 funding process that will start up in about August, September.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're very welcome.
So I have a question. I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Would it be possible to use some of our CDBG dollars that we've allocated to the city and reallocate that to purchase properties and to use for a New Leaf to make that transition? And as far as the transition of people, it's 4 to 6 people anyway. Can we use the CDGB dollars allocated for this year and making the purchase, given that I think some of the city dollars that we've allocated for the homelessness project and $1.5 million, which we haven't completely identified, I question whether we can use the full amount. Can we take 500,000 and buy a couple of properties? And then reimburse it the following year by selling the properties into the CDGB dollars and reallocate those back to the city in the homelessness project.
Councilmember Duff, we could absolutely look at utilizing some of those CDBG and home funds. It would be a new project, so it would have to go through some type of an application or at least through a substantial amendment with HUD. So if it's an existing project, we can take funds and move it around within our 20% cap. But when it's a new project, we would have to go through a different allocation for that.
So the dollars that we're setting aside for the city and Mesa for a homeless project, is that been through an application process? We don't even have it really identified, so I assume that it hadn't.
Councilmember Duff, when the city's considered an entitlement community with the CDBG funds, so we automatically receive those funds. The city can opt to utilize all of the CDBG funds that we receive and keep it for city projects and priorities that we identify in-house, or we can go through a funding application process, which then nonprofits apply for. So since this is the city departments that are utilizing these funds, there's not per se an application process, it's more of a set-aside process. So when we're allocating funds to a nonprofit, it does go through a competitive application process.
I understand. Okay, so I'm saying for this suggested allocation that we have, and the city has $1.5 million for homeless, it is say that we kept $1 million of it, we're putting that towards the homeless project, and we're gonna take $500,000 to buy a couple of properties to house New Leaf. Now, we own the properties just as the same as we do now, and I realize we have some other things regarding. Okay, and then we put up the properties that we have, the two in question for sale, return those dollars and back into CDGB dollars for the 21-22 year. Those monies are now available for the city to use. We can use on a homeless project or no?
Councilmember Duff, if I'm understanding your question correctly, once we were to sell the properties and then reimburse the CDBG funds, could those be used for a homeless project? Was that the question?
Yes, I'm reallocating those monies. We have $1.5 million set aside for the city to use for a homeless project. If we used $1 million for the homeless project and took $500,000 to buy two properties that New Leaf could use under the same conditions, the city is still the owner. New Leaf we buy the properties, New Leaf transitions into those. After that, we sell the properties, reimburse CDGB, which is going in the 21-22 allocation, the dollars we'd have available. I mean, does that work?
Councilmember Duff, it does work in theory. There are a little bit of complications there. So if the city purchases the property and we want to have services, whether it's transitional services, whatever type services, we would have to do an RFP for specific nonprofit to utilize that property. We couldn't just choose, say, a New Leaf to operate out of that facility. The best bet would be for a New Leaf to come to the city and request funding. That way they could purchase the property, they would own the property, and then they could utilize it for one of the purposes that's under a CDBG eligible activity.
The current situation is that we own the properties that New Leaf is using right now, right?
Correct.
And so that's not allocated to a New Leaf. We own the properties and we allow New Leaf to use the properties. So if we use $500,000 from this year's, this upcoming year's allocation and bought a couple of properties The city would own them. We could allow New Leaf to use them. We will take the old properties, sell them, and then put those monies back into the CDBG dollars. That following year, if New Leaf chooses, they could, ask for those allocation of the funds, or we could continue to lease as we do now on those properties. Either way, anyway, we're returning the money that we are earmarking for the city this year to use for or returning it back into the bucket the following year into CDBG dollars.
That is correct, Councilmember Duff. The issue is if the city were to purchase the property and the city owned the property, so a new property, we would have to do a request for proposal for services out of that facility. If a New Leaf were allocated the funds directly through an application process, then they would be able to operate their services directly out of the property. So that's the difference between the city owning the property and a New Leaf purchasing the property with funds that are allocated directly to them. Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit confusing, but when the city owns something, owns a piece of property or owns, puts an investment in with CDBG funds, we have to go through a procurement process for services.
So if I could just weigh in real quickly, I think what Michelle's trying to say is that if it's the committee's desire to move in a direction like what you're suggesting, that she's saying there's a way to do it. If we were to set aside those dollars and allocate them to a New Leaf, there wouldn't have to be that competition factor. So they would have more time and flexibility to go look for properties that would meet their needs in that way. If we decide to just go sell it and then put the monies back in, and then we have to go through that whole process again. So we're trying to just give you that information about the competitive process and what's needed or how to create that flexibility.
Thank you, Natalie, for the clarification.
So it's just a suggestion somewhere in there, and you guys know so much more about this than I do. I'm just asking if there's a feasible way for it to work or not. And I don't want to pretend to even figure out all the solutions to that, but is it a feasible idea?
Councilmember Duff, there's definitely a way that it can be done. There's different strings attached, there's different processes and requirements depending on how it is done.
Could it be somewhat seamless without causing a lot of disruption?
I would say that it would be a minimum of 6 months to a year, depending on the process that we go through, whether the city purchases it and does an RFP, or whether a New Leaf comes back at the next funding process and requests funds. So that would be a longer process because our funding kickoff will start approximately September, and those funds would be available for fiscal year 2021, which would start in July of next year. I'm sorry, 21, 22. Getting confused with the dates. 21, 22. So it wouldn't be just a quick, maybe 1 month process. It would be a minimum of 6 months to over a year.
I know Councilmember Luna has a question or comment.
Yes, if we could bring up my cues again. My question to Mike is, what kind of disruption of services would occur if this were to happen? Now we're hearing 6 months to a year. We currently have the facilities program. What would be the experience that New Leaf would suffer as a result of whether we sell the property, keep the money ourselves, and then you wait 6 months to a year to provide your services?
Let me just be perfectly transparent here, as my history dictates that I always am. First of all, it's very difficult for a New Leaf because we don't want to bite the hand that feeds us. You have been tremendously supportive, the city. The simple reality is that these two sites work for us. They work for the clients, mainly because of the transportation, mainly because of the size of the buildings. I don't know if we would be able to find anything near, when you looked at the current appraised value of, I guess, between the two properties, $750,000. They're two distinctly different properties, so you would have to have two different places. Of course, it would cause disruption. It would cause, some lack of clarification for us. We've always been able to adjust. I do not want to dismiss that. We've always been able to go with the flow. At the same time, we've been in these buildings and we've run these programs and we've been there for like 20-plus years. So, yes, it would cause disruption. Yes, it would cause difficulty. Would we overcome that? Yes, we would always find a way, and you know that we always do find a way. But yes, it would cause, I think it would cause hardship, and I think it would cause confusion. So again, we always follow what the city suggests, and we're here to, again, ask for the support that you've always given us. I don't know how it would work with a competitive process. So who's to say how long-term that would impact us? But it could impact us adversely.
Mike, is the 217 West University property, it's used for IT currently. Is that 100% used? Is 100% of that space used, or is it just?
Yes, we want to actually, that was a temporary thing because we're in between programs. We just didn't want the program to sit empty. That's why we wanted to put the DV Stop program there. I think one thing that should be noted too, there's no parking. It is a very challenged space due to the parking actually has, I think, 4. There's a little side driveway off University, and then there's street parking, but there's really no parking lot. Adequate parking is very limited.
So moving the DV program, is parking going to be a problem there?
Actually, no, because many of those people do not, we would provide the transportation, and many of those people do not have transportation themselves. So that they would depend on the bus lines, things like that. And then we would pick up, and that's how we currently work it.
The university and project is at University in Hobson.
Yes.
It's an IT building.
Yes.
Entry to the historic district of downtown. And it's right on the corner on, I don't know. Councilman Heredia, your take on all this?
Yeah, for me, looking at this issue, I understand your this is your district, Councilwoman Duff, but I think my thinking around this is that I understand that there might be a different use for this corner entryway to a historic district, but also the importance of having individuals to partake into what's happening and what's evolving, all types of individuals, what's evolving into our downtown in these areas. It's an important aspect for me as far as an outlook moving forward. And as I look at the prices, as far as these properties could make if sold, I also looking at the market, it's going to take a lot more money. I am envisioning, estimating that to acquire other similar properties. I'm assuming, or the finding the right property. Just I'm estimating that it would cost us more money than what we're taking in. Not sure, as the evolving market has, what we're going through right now, what if that changes the housing and land market in the near future. But just looking at pricing, I think finding comparable or buildings that make sense for a new leaf could result in us spending a lot more money in addition to the displacement and to the services that are happening here. So I'm leaning towards option 2 as far as the piece there, but I know that's I get your comments as well, Councilwoman Duff, as we're looking to kind of bring up these areas based on our previous discussion in the study session on how we can really amplify these districts, but also, adding diversities and diversity of people and diversity of activity is important as well for me.
I totally understand that, and I totally get and support it, absolutely. And I'm not opposed to it being in these neighborhoods and these locations. What I'm concerned about is the economic value, and that economic value contributes to what we can do as a city, the monies that we have available to operate. Because if they were a block in, I wouldn't even bring this up. If they were in the neighborhood, but since they're at a place that there's been a lot of interest of people wanting to acquire properties for businesses, for things that add to the economic viability of it's just a matter of them being on the arterial. It's not about them being in the neighborhood. And there's nothing wrong with them being in the neighborhood. So please don't misunderstand. And yes, the healthiest environment when we're trying to help people get on their path is having them in the environment of neighborhoods and all the bonds that we create in our community. Absolutely. My question is, since these are strategic and there could be strategically, economically viable and being productive, so.
Councilwoman Duff, may I say something?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that has always created conflict for us is the sense of, candidly speaking, NIMBYism. And so we have actually always benefited by being on what I would call University Drive, Mesa Drive, Main Street. We have avoided, in a very positive way, neighborhoods not wanting, in a sense, our services in the middle of the neighborhood, because typically these types of programs are not as welcomed. So for the most part, there is a opposite effect in terms of going into neighborhoods. Sometimes it is more difficult than being on these major streets, and that's why we've tried to always, as you know, I've mentioned earlier, the University University. We have a lot of programs, and we've not met the resistance typically that you could meet in a neighborhood.
Councilwoman Duff, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. We're talking about the downtown square mile area where we have a form-based code and we have multi-use throughout our neighborhood. So I'm not talking about going into an HOA area or anything like that, or an established I'm talking about within the context of the area that we already are. I think I'm belaboring it. So I know we just have to have a recommendation for this to go to council. And so I do recommend that we further that at council.
Sorry, anything else, Councilmember Luna?
No, I thank you for that recommendation. I also support it moving to council. I think having the properties transferred over is a good thing for New Leaf. They've been a wonderful partner for the past 50 years. It's a very, very difficult situation. I appreciate Councilmember Duff and her, making sure that she does what she thinks is best for her council district, and I thank you for that. But New Leaf has been a tremendous partner for over the past 50 years, and they provided wonderful service, especially for those individuals that are most vulnerable. So I'm going to go ahead and support the options for the transfer of property.
So I think, could we, I would like to have, move maybe the first two options to have a more discussion at council, at the council level. Because I think keep leasing the third option, I don't hear that as an option, but maybe 1 and 2, so that we can then have a council discussion with the rest of the members and see what we decide as a whole there. Is that possible to move on with those 2 recommendations and have a discussion there at the council? Natalie?
Yeah, Councilmember Heredia, absolutely. We can take this to the full city council and we will focus on those 2 top alternatives. It would be helpful at this point just to have a majority of a committee vote, if you will, just so that we can take that recommendation in addition to these 2 options to the full city council.
Chairperson Heredia, we don't have a vote on the agenda for this morning. So if it would just be if each committee member would like to state what their preference is or what the recommendation is, that's what we could go forward with to the council.
So hearing Councilmember Luna, you suggest option 2. Would it be okay to push the discussion for 1 and 2 to the council, or you're still sticking to just option 2?
I'm going to stick to option 2. That's my recommendation.
Councilwoman Duff, what are your thoughts?
My recommendation is to keep all the options for discussion at council.
So I would recommend to push this to the whole city council and have a discussion then in respect to, Councilwoman Duff's, this is her district and in ensuring that we have more robust discussion and see what are the other thoughts of the council members and have that piece, being fleshed out there. And so I go with Councilwoman Duff's recommendation and move these options towards the city council.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Great. Anybody else, Deanne?
Chairperson Heredia, I don't believe there's any other members of the public that have shown up for the meeting. So if that was the last issue on your agenda, the final issue would be moving for adjournment.
So moved.
Second? Or Jenkins second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.